Cerro Corá, northeastern Paraguay. March 1870. The jungle is thick. The air is heavy with heat and mud. And somewhere, through the trees, a column of men is moving. But calling them an army would be generous. These are the last soldiers of Paraguay. Teenage boys carrying rifles taller than themselves. Old men who can barely walk. The sick, the starving. Anyone who is still breathing and can hold a weapon. At the front of this shrinking column is Francisco Solano López, the president of Paraguay. But he is no longer leading a modernizing nation. He is no longer commanding one of the strongest armies in South America. He is running. He is being hunted. And Brazilian forces are closing in from every direction. 6 years earlier, López stood at the head of a country that had railroads, ironworks, and a military that made its neighbors nervous. Now, that country barely exists. Its cities are empty. Its farms are abandoned. Its men are gone. And by the time the shooting stops here at Cerro Corá, Paraguay will be missing most of its men. And the country will enter history as the country of women. This is the story of the War of the Triple Alliance. Some call it the Paraguayan War. Others call it the Guerra Grande. It was the longest and bloodiest war in the history of Latin America. It pitted one small landlocked country against 3 of its neighbors at the same time: the Empire of Brazil, the Argentine Republic, and Uruguay. So in this video, we are going to answer 3 questions. Why did Paraguay believe it had to fight? How did its early offensives turn into a national catastrophe? And how did the aftermath reshape gender, society, and politics for generations? But to understand how this war started, we need to zoom out, because this conflict did not come from nowhere. It came from a region that was, in many ways, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Now, by the middle of the 1800s, South America was a continent of new countries with old problems. Spain and Portugal were gone, but the borders they left behind were messy, overlapping, unclear, and that created tension, especially in the Rio de la Plata region. There were territorial disputes everywhere. Brazil and Paraguay argued over the Mato Grosso border zone, where the land between the Apa and Branco rivers was claimed by both sides. Argentina and Paraguay clashed over the Chaco and Misiones regions. Nobody could fully agree on where one country ended and another began. But the biggest issue, the one that made everything more dangerous, was the rivers. Paraguay was landlocked. It had no coastline, no direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. So the Paraná-Paraguay river system was not just a trade route for Paraguay, it was an existential lifeline. Everything that came into the country and everything that went out moved through those rivers. That's why any tariff, any blockade, any restriction on navigation felt like a hand around Paraguay's throat, and the countries that controlled those waterways knew it. Brazil had the resources and the naval strength to dominate the rivers. Argentina was consolidating its national authority and tightening its grip on the downstream passages. Uruguay was caught in the middle, unstable, politically fractured, and constantly being pulled in different directions by its larger neighbors. So this was the situation. 4 countries, disputed borders, a river system that meant life or death for one of them. And at the center of it all, Paraguay, trying to secure its autonomy and its access to the outside world. Now, to understand Paraguay's mindset going into this war, you have to understand what Paraguay looked like before the fire. Under the López dynasty, Paraguay had gone through a remarkable transformation. The state controlled most of the economy, and it poured resources into modernization. The government brought in British engineers and technicians. It built a railroad, one of the first in South America. It developed a shipyard to build river steamers, and it constructed the Iquique Ironworks, a foundry that could produce cannons, tools, and military equipment. Just think about this. A small landlocked country in the interior of South America. And it has a functioning ironworks. It has a railroad under construction. It has steamships on its rivers. For a nation of its size, this was extraordinary. And it was a source of deep national pride. But all of this modernization had a military edge because Paraguay's leaders understood something very clearly. In a region full of larger, more powerful neighbors, survival depended on strength. That's why, by the early 1860s, Paraguay fielded one of the strongest standing armies in the entire region. Some estimates put it at around 60,000 to 80,000 men under arms, a staggering number for a country of its population. And the man overseeing all of this was Francisco Solano López. He had traveled to Europe, he had seen modern armies, he had seen what industrialized states could do. And he came back to Paraguay with a vision: security through strength, leverage through the rivers, survival through deterrence. Now, was López a reckless aggressor who overestimated his country's power, or was he a ruler responding to real threats, a leader of a small, vulnerable state surrounded by powers that could choke it off at any moment? That debate has raged for over 150 years, but what is clear is that by 1864, López believed his country was being cornered, and the spark that lit the fuse came not from Paraguay, but from Uruguay. Uruguay by this point was fractured. Two political factions, the Blancos and the Colorados, were fighting for control of the country. And this wasn't just an internal Uruguayan problem, because both factions had foreign backers. Paraguay supported the Blancos. Brazil supported the Colorados. So when Brazil intervened militarily in Uruguay in 1864 to support the Colorado Party and push out the Blanco government, López did not see it as a local Uruguayan issue. He saw it as a direct threat to the regional balance of power. If Brazil could topple a government in Uruguay, what would stop it from turning its attention to Paraguay next? That's why López escalated. In November 1864, Paraguayan forces seized the Brazilian steamer Marquês de Olinda as it traveled up the Paraguay River. It was a dramatic move, a direct act of war against the Empire of Brazil. And López didn't stop there. He ordered an invasion of the Mato Grosso, sending Paraguayan troops deep into Brazilian territory. But López had a problem. To strike at Brazil's southern provinces and to support his allies in Uruguay, he needed to move troops through Argentine territory. So he asked Argentina for permission to cross Corrientes province. Argentina said no, and that refusal changed everything, because López responded by declaring war on Argentina and invading Corrientes as well. Now, Paraguay wasn't fighting one neighbor, it was fighting two. And with Uruguay's Blanco government already falling, the Colorado government that replaced it quickly joined Brazil and Argentina. On May 1st, 1865, the three countries signed the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay formally united against Paraguay. What had started as a regional crisis over Uruguay had now hardened into a full-scale coalition war against a single, landlocked country. Now, in the early months, Paraguay had the initiative. Its forces struck fast. The Mato Grosso invasion covered enormous distances through jungle and frontier territory, raiding isolated Brazilian outposts. The Corrientes invasion caught Argentina off guard. For a brief moment, it looked like Paraguay's gamble might work. But that moment did not last. In June 1865, the Brazilian Navy met the Paraguayan fleet at the Battle of Riachuelo. And this is where the war turned. Brazil's navy was larger, better equipped, and better trained for river combat. The battle was brutal. And when it was over, Paraguay's fleet was destroyed. The rivers, those same rivers that were Paraguay's lifeline, were now controlled by Brazil. This was catastrophic, because without control of the waterways, Paraguay could not resupply, it could not export anything. The country was now under a naval blockade, and its connection to the outside world was cut. The war had turned from a series of offensives into a slow suffocation. By April 1866, the Allied forces, Brazilian, Argentine, and Uruguayan, crossed into Paraguayan territory. They expected momentum. They expected to push through, take the capital, and end the war quickly. But Paraguay had prepared a defense that would shock them. The fortress of Humaitá sat on the banks of the Paraguay River, surrounded by swamps, earthworks, and heavy artillery. It was designed to control the river and block any advance toward Asunción. And behind Humaitá, López had built an entire defensive system. Trenches, gun positions, natural barriers that turned the southern approach into a killing ground. The Allies pushed forward anyway, and in September 1866, they ran straight into the Battle of Curupayty. It was a disaster. Allied forces attacked fortified Paraguayan positions across open ground, through mud and marshland, into concentrated artillery and rifle fire. The assault was shattered. Thousands of Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in a matter of hours. The idea of a quick victory died at Curupayty. The war bogged down. For months, the two sides faced each other across flooded trenches and muddy fortifications. Cholera swept through the camps. Both sides. Men died not from bullets, but from disease, from starvation, from the sheer misery of a war that had turned into a siege. But the Allies had something Paraguay didn't: resources. Brazil could replace its losses. It could bring in more men, more ships, more supplies. Paraguay could not. Eventually, the Allied command changed. The Duque de Caxias, one of Brazil's most experienced military leaders, took over. And under Caxias, the strategy shifted. Instead of frontal assaults against the Humaitá line, the Allies maneuvered. They outflanked. They applied pressure from multiple directions. And in 1868, Humaitá finally fell. The fortress that had held the Allies at bay for nearly 2 years was captured. And once Humaitá fell, the road to Asunción stopped being hypothetical. In January 1869, Allied forces entered the capital of Paraguay. But what they found was not a city preparing to surrender. It was a city that was already empty. The population had fled. The government had fled. López had fled. Asunción was a ghost town. Buildings stood vacant. Streets were deserted. The Allies had taken the capital, but there was no state left to accept their victory. Because López refused to surrender, he retreated into the interior of Paraguay, into the hills, the forests, the places where roads barely existed. And he took what was left of his army with him. But by now, calling it an army was almost a lie. The men who had marched to war in 1864 were gone, dead, captured, wasted by disease. So López filled the ranks with whoever was left. Teenage boys, some as young as 12, were put into uniform and handed weapons. Old men who should have been sitting by their fires were marched into the jungle. The sick, the wounded, anyone who could still move. The war shifted from set-piece battles to a hunt. Brazilian forces pursued López across the Paraguayan interior for over a year. It was no longer a war between armies. It was a pursuit of a man and the remnants of a nation that refused to stop fighting. And it ended where we began. Cerro Corá, March 1st, 1870. Brazilian cavalry caught up with López's last column. In the fighting that followed, Francisco Solano López was killed. According to accounts, his last words were, I die with my country. The war was over. It had lasted nearly 6 years. And what it left behind was unlike anything South America had ever seen. Now, let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers from this war are almost hard to believe. Paraguay suffered a demographic collapse that has very few parallels in modern history. While exact figures are debated, recent scholarship suggests that Paraguay lost between 60 and 69% of its entire population during the war. Not just soldiers, the total population. Civilians died from starvation, disease, displacement, and the sheer destruction of a country that was turned into a battlefield for 6 years. But the losses were not spread evenly. The war consumed men. An estimated 90% of Paraguay's adult male population was killed. Let that sit for a moment. 9 out of every 10 adult men, gone. The 1871 census counted 28,746 men over the age of 15 and 106,254 women over the age of 15. That is roughly 3.7 adult women for every single adult man. In the most devastated municipalities, the ratio was even more extreme. In some areas, there were only 5 males for every 100 females of fertile age, a 20-to-1 ratio, and this was not a short-term blip. A census taken in 1886, 16 years after the war ended, still showed 3 women for every 1 man among Paraguayans over the age of 30. The generation that had been of draft age during the war had a male-to-female ratio of just 0.306. That's roughly 3.27 women per man. To put this in perspective, after World War II, the Soviet Union, which suffered enormous casualties, had a male-to-female ratio of 0.796 for the 1-8 to 4 age group by 1959. Paraguay's ratio in 1870 was 0.338. The imbalance in Paraguay was far worse. That's why Paraguay became known as the country of women, not as a metaphor, as a demographic reality. And this demographic collapse did not just change numbers on a census, it changed everything about how Paraguayan society worked. With most men dead, women became the heads of households, not by choice, by necessity. They took over farms, they managed labor, they raised children alone. Female-headed households became the norm, not the exception. And out-of-wedlock births surged, as the traditional family structure that had existed before the war simply could not function anymore. Women, children, and the elderly became the entire labor force of the country. Women took on work that had been considered exclusively male: harvesting, textile production, even tasks connected to what remained of military manufacturing. They became the sole engines of the Paraguayan economy. In the few professions that existed after the war, women stepped in to replace the men who were gone. Teaching, for example, became an almost entirely female field because it was one of the few roles where society permitted women to replace their missing male counterparts. But here is the painful irony. Despite the fact that women were literally holding the country together, farming the land, raising the children, running the economy, the post-war legal system pushed them backward. The marriage code, enacted between 1870 and 1897, declared women unfit to perform critical economic roles without male permission. Women were placed under the legal control of their fathers or husbands, and Paraguay became the last country in all of Latin America to grant women the right to vote. Not until 1961, nearly a century after the war ended. As for repopulation, the situation was so extreme that social norms shifted. Men were informally encouraged, even expected, to father children with multiple women to help rebuild the population. This practice was widespread. It even extended to members of the clergy. The country needed people, and the pressure to repopulate shaped sexual culture, family structure, and social expectations for generations. But recovery was painfully slow. The demographic crisis did not fully subside until after 1910. The government tried to attract European immigrants to rebuild the labor force, as Argentina and Brazil had done successfully. But Paraguay, devastated, remote, and impoverished, could not draw massive numbers. Instead, it got small ethnic enclaves, German settlers, Japanese communities, Mennonite colonies, important, but nowhere near enough to replace what had been lost. Now, Paraguay was not the only country changed by this war. The winners were transformed too. Paraguay's infrastructure was destroyed. The railroad, the ironworks, the shipyard, all of it gone. The modernization that the López dynasty had built over decades was completely undone. And to pay the massive war debts imposed by the victors, Paraguay's government was forced to sell public lands to foreign companies, mostly Argentine. This created a system of enormous landholdings called latifundios, owned by outsiders. That skewed land ownership persists in Paraguay to this day. Indigenous communities were devastated as well. In many municipalities, 9 out of 10 adult indigenous men were absent, killed, mobilized, or displaced. And with the population shattered and local resistance weakened, the post-war state found it far easier to seize indigenous lands and sell them to foreign yerba mate and livestock companies. The war didn't just kill people, it opened the door for the theft of ancestral territories. As for Brazil, the war professionalized the Brazilian army. Officers who had fought in Paraguay came home with a new sense of political identity and institutional power. That newly powerful military eventually became the force that overthrew the Brazilian monarchy in 1889. The war also accelerated Brazil's abolitionist movement, as thousands of enslaved men had been freed to serve in the military. Once they had fought for the empire, it became harder to justify keeping their people in chains. And Argentina used the war to consolidate its national government. The conflict helped define the country's modern borders and strengthen the authority of the central state over its provinces. So the war's consequences radiated outward like aftershocks. Paraguay was wrecked, but Brazil and Argentina were also fundamentally changed. Now, there is one more thing we need to talk about, and that is the question of blame. For a long time, the traditional view was simple. Francisco Solano López was a megalomaniac, a reckless dictator who dragged his country into a war it could not win because of personal ambition and delusions of grandeur. This was the story told by the victors, and it dominated for nearly a century. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, a revisionist view emerged. This interpretation argued that British imperialism had secretly engineered the war to destroy Paraguay's independent economic model, that foreign powers had manipulated Brazil and Argentina into crushing a country that dared to modernize on its own terms. It was a powerful narrative, especially in an era of anti-colonial thinking. But modern mainstream scholarship has largely moved past both of these extremes. Historians today find little hard evidence for a British conspiracy, and they find the lone madman explanation too simple. Instead, the current understanding emphasizes regional rivalries, failed diplomacy, state-building pressures, and a genuine security dilemma. A small landlocked country surrounded by larger powers, making decisions out of fear and calculation that spiraled into catastrophe. The truth is, nations and generations explain trauma differently. Paraguay's memory of this war is not the same as Brazil's. Argentina tells the story one way, modern scholars tell it another, And that battle over memory, over who was the villain, who was the victim, who bears responsibility, has never fully ended. Because the war itself never fully ended in Paraguay's national consciousness. The demographic scar, the gender imbalance, the country of women identity, these are not just historical fact. They are lived experiences that shaped families, communities, and social norms for over a century. Modern research even suggests that communities most heavily affected by male loss during the war show measurably different social patterns today, including higher rates of intimate partner violence, linked to the intergenerational transmission of gender norms that emerged from that catastrophic imbalance. The war did not just redraw borders, it rewrote households, labor, law, and memory. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.